Well, good morning, everyone, or whatever time of day it is where you're joining us from. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. I'm the editor of The Catalyst, published by the Bush Institute. Thank you for joining us for this Engage event presented by NexPoint. Excuse me. So we're holding today's discussion to promote the publication of the spring 2024 issue of The Catalyst, which you can read, find, and subscribe to at bushcenter.org/catalyst. The focus of this issue is America's global leadership. As the recent bitter battle in Congress over whether to send more aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan showed, the United States is once again reconsidering what role it should play abroad. For most of the last 75 years, since World War II or so, American policymakers, while they've disagreed over the specifics, have generally agreed with the basic principle that Washington should be very engaged with the world beyond America's borders. Today, however, that consensus is fracturing. Given the rising dissent on both the left and the right, and in both parties, we at the Bush Institute decided to use this issue of The Catalyst to remind Americans and people everywhere why pursuing an active and engaged foreign policy remains in everyone's interests. To do this, we were very lucky to have three superb people write for the issue and then agree to join us today. Bailey Hutchison, as you all know, was a U.S. Senator from Texas from 1993 to 2013, and then U.S. Ambassador to NATO from 2017 to 2021, as well as many other things. Jendayi Frazer, as well as many other things, is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and a former U.S. Ambassador to South Africa. And Antonio Garza, as well as many other things, was U.S. Ambassador to Mexico from 2002 to 2009. Welcome, ambassadors. Thank you so much for joining us. So here's how today is going to work. I'm going to kick things off by asking our guests some questions. Then around the 30-minute mark, I'd like to start taking questions from you in our audience. You can submit questions by clicking the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Senator Hutchison, I'm going to start with you. In describing the basic principles essential for a successful U.S. foreign policy in your essay, you emphasize trust above all else. Tell us what you have in mind and why you think it's so important.
Yes, well, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for the wonderful Catalyst program you're putting together, but also the podcast so that people can read our in-depth columns as well. And of course, having been at NATO with now 32 partners and 40 partnerships, 32 allies, 40 partners, it became very clear to me that A, the U.S. is the leader of the free world, and B, it must be the leader of the free world, because we are the country that will assess a risk and then deter against that risk to avoid conflict. And of course, the reliability of the U.S. is essential for our allies to know that when we say this is what we are going to do, that they can rely on us to do it and do it right. And then, of course, it also sends the message to our adversaries that here is what we're going to do, and if you cross this line, then we will do it. And that is so important that both our allies and our adversaries know that they can trust us to be on their side or not, and what the consequences of that are.
So let me follow up with that. In order to be credible, the United States needs to be consistent when it makes commitments. As you point out in your essay, under the U.S. democratic system, that requires public support, right? An engaged foreign policy or any policy to be sustained requires you and government to have the public behind you. At this moment in time, Americans seem unusually preoccupied with their own domestic economic and political problems, and many are increasingly skeptical of the value of international engagement. How should Washington deal with that? Why should voters care about US foreign policy? How does it affect their lives? And how can our government in Washington make that point to convince them that this stuff actually does matter?
That is such an important question because, of course, as you said, the people are looking for their own priorities when they are voting, and that is the strength of our democracy. But I think maybe the partisanship that has emerged so strongly in the last few years, that people have begun to make the foreign policy part of a partisan issue difference. That has not been the case in most of our century, most of our time in almost 200 years that we've been in a republic. And it's important because for our allies to trust us, they need to know there is a consistency among Congress and the administration. And if there is a difference, and we are seeing more controversy among members of Congress regarding what the administration is doing, and that, of course, devalues that strength of reliability and trust. So I think what I would say to the Washington people in office now is that we need to talk about the importance of foreign policy as it affects not only our security, and America is the leading security country in the world, in the free world, for sure, but also our trade, our relationships. The whole trust issue affects what we pay in the cost of goods, because what we pay in trade, or what affects our prices in trade would be if we have free trade, or we have sanctions, or we have tariffs. So all of that is together in our foreign policy. And of course, for our foreign partners to buy from America, to buy our goods, that means jobs. It means our employment. It means our sustainability of our economy. So foreign policy is the policy for our jobs, our economy, our security, and we need to treat that as a package.
Great. Dr. Frazer, Ambassador Frazer and Ambassador Garza, I want to bring you in on this point as well and have you address first Jendayi, you please, and then you, Tony, this question as it applies to your regions. And let me ask you sort of the question in two parts. The first is going to seem blindingly obvious to you, which is why should Africa or Latin America matter? But make the case to a skeptical US voter, especially because I think these regions are often thought about by a lot of Americans as net consumers of US goods, that is, of things, whether it's security or assistance, that the United States sends them, not as providers of goods that the United States, and I mean goods in the most abstract sense, of things that the United States benefits from as well. So the question, which I've made too long already, is how does the United States, how do American voters benefit from an engaged policy with Africa and then with Latin America?
Well, let me just say, Jonathan, I think of it in two ways. One is the basic American public isn't that interested in foreign policy in the first place. Let's be honest about that. It's really very much focused on domestic policy. So we're often driven to try to justify strong American leadership globally in terms of domestic policy orientation. But when you're actually crafting policy, it's the interested public that you're trying to convince more than the general public. So, that's just the reality of the situation. And when we talk about the interested public in Africa, we've still fortunate to have strong bipartisanship about the need to engage the continent. Now, that bipartisanship has shifted in terms of themes. Since particularly the Trump administration, the focus has been on balancing or challenging China and now Russia, which has increased this engagement. And so it's a global game, really. It's unfortunately looking a little bit like the Cold War. We don't want it to get to that level, of course, and it's very different. There are many different ways in terms of the entanglement of the U.S. and China that's not the same as the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But I think that there has been this sense of a competition with China, but I would put it more positively. What can the U.S. gain from Africa? I think that the main thing is you have to look at the size of the continent. It's 1.4 billion people. You have to look at the demographics of the continent. It's the fastest growing region in the world and the youngest region in the world. And soon it'll be 40% of the population, and the majority of them are working age. It's a working age population. And so typically highly productive if you invest in education and health and other sectors. So the opportunity is tremendous for American companies to engage that market, right? And so it's not so much about Africa pulling on our resources, it's about what opportunity there is for American companies in Africa. Secondly, when we don't engage, we tend to be left behind. We see that now with the importance of critical minerals and strategic minerals, right? A tremendous amount of those minerals are in Africa, and China has been playing in there and has locked up that supply chain for the most part. And now we're sort of behind the curve trying to get there and trying to actually engage in those economies to process those critical minerals, hopefully on the continent, so it creates jobs for this growing population instead of just taking out raw materials without any value added. So I would say that as well. But really the key constituents for Africa have been faith-based organizations that, through missionary and other activities have people on the ground. Those people come home to their communities, to their churches. They talk about their experiences in Africa. You have students who go over there for abroad studies programs. They come home, they talk about their experiences in Africa. That's important. You have trade associations, chambers of commerce. So the private sector is also very much engaged. And then you have diaspora communities as well. And so when you have that mix, that's really the public that you're trying to convince about any particular policy issue. But in general, I would say that given that we are truly in a strategic competition with China, and that competition has to do with the nature of the international financial architecture and the rules of the game for trade, et cetera. If we want to protect our workers, and we want to protect our business, and we want to protect our innovation, we need friends and partners working in those international organizations like the UN and other places that set the rules to be more favorable and on our side than the type of international order that China is trying to establish.
That's fascinating. Thank you. So, Tony, now to you. How would you frame the argument, maybe to a skeptical American, about why actually getting more involved and ending what you call this long tradition of neglect of Latin America is in Americans' own interests?
Yeah. First of all, Jonathan, thank you for what you're doing there with the Catalyst and at the Presidential Center. And I hope Senator Hutchison doesn't mind me referencing a conversation we had probably in the 90s, okay? And I think an important part of making foreign policy relevant is talking about it in ways that people have a relationship to it. In the 90s, the senator was involved in issues around Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I met her in South Texas, and we were talking about trade. And the ability to talk about free markets and free peoples and America's role in the world and have a thread that runs through all of them is what makes it, I think, gives a certain urgency and a certain relevancy to people in their day-to-day lives. And that's what it involves people in these kinds of discussions. Unfortunately, we've fallen away from that a bit. In a sense, I think that the case for Latin America starts with Mexico and the integration and the trade that we've seen. And Mexico is now obviously our largest trading partner, and the impact that that means in terms of jobs for people here in this country. But a lot of the argument around Mexico has moved from the strictly economic to the geopolitical and security. And certainly in the wake of the pandemic, I think what was laid bare for all that had moved manufacturing offshore, and in many respects to China and other parts of the world, was that these vulnerable supply chains might best be addressed by bringing them closer to home. And so this whole discussion around nearshoring and investing in Mexico and building on that platform in North America was laid bare in the pandemic, and I think has been accelerated, where you have chaos in the world impacting everything from the Red Sea. Our relationship with China grows more tense. I think Taiwan and some activity around there isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and bringing these things home. In Panama, you've seen climate impacting the canal. So the argument around bringing investment to Mexico and building out to Central America and Latin America, I think, is one that's not only economic, but it's geopolitical and speaks to the security of our country. Why haven't we done it historically? I think part of it was, if you look at the early part of America's history, we were more concerned about our expansion westward. In the mid 1800s, we had the Monroe Doctrine, trying to keep the Europeans sort of stiff arming them, keeping them at bay and out of Latin America. And we really didn't have the capacity in the early 1900s to project power, either economic or militarily. And it was only in the wake of really World War II when NATO became, and Europe, and I think that focused our attention there, and waves of academics and scholars and foreign policy people and diplomats wanted to play in Europe, or the Cold War, a fascination with the Sovietology became kind of a whole industry. And then the mystique of China. So Latin America was sort of, it wasn't top of mind. I used to say the good news about Latin America is it's not leading the news. The bad news about Latin America is it's not leading the news. And so consequently, you didn't have the kind of attention paid that I think really makes a lot of sense now, not only economically, but the geopolitics. And, Dr. Frazer talked about, critical minerals and these sorts of things, abundant in countries like Chile and Bolivia and Brazil. And I think the investment is relatively modest in terms of, proximity and ability to integrate and build on existing platforms. So, going back to the conversation that I alluded to the senator and I having in the 90s, make it relevant. Have that thread that runs through free markets, free peoples, and America's role in the world be one that people understand.
Thank you. Senator, let me come back to you. Wearing your other hat as a former ambassador, you served most recently as ambassador to NATO, which you write about at length in the piece. Many NATO countries, many of our partners in the alliance, are now worried about the durability of the United States' commitment to the organization because of skeptical comments that President Trump has made. Explain why you think NATO is still so important, and then how do we convince our allies that we do in fact remain committed?
Yes, of course, all the time that I was serving, that was a question that was very, very relevant. And I think that we do need to be in NATO, of course. We need to lead NATO because we want to be in on the front. That's why NATO was created, so America would not come in after the conflict has boiled over in Europe, but to be there before to deter that conflict. And of course, our allies, because there are 32, well, actually 31 European, 30 European allies. The other two are Canada and the U.S. And because of those 30 having competition among themselves in the EU. Some are not in the EU as well, but they are trade competitors, economic competitors, as well as in the security alliance of NATO. So we are the arbiter that they trust because we are trying to do what's right for all of us. And what's good for us, for our people to realize, is that it is so important to have 32 countries talking with our strategic goals, which we are, and we have been for the 75 years that NATO has been in place. So it's not America going out and saying, this is the way it should be done, speaking alone. No, it is America speaking with 31 partners that are ready to make the ultimate sacrifice if we don't do things right. And so we have to be the leader. We are the one that is the trusted arbiter, and we must continue to earn that trust by assessing the risk and then putting forward the plans, which we do at NATO, to deter that risk. In 2018, the U.S. declared in our 10-year strategic review in the Department of Defense that our ultimate potential adversary was going to be China. So we presented that in NATO to say, here's what we're looking at. We're looking at the Belt and Road Initiative. We're looking at the aggressive predatory lending in South America, which I'm sure that Ambassador Garza also has seen. In Africa, for sure. We are seeing the predatory nature of that. We are also seeing that China would not step up and acknowledge the COVID-19 issue before it was rampantly hurting all of our economies. We saw so much of that aggression that we brought our allies into our way of thinking, and NATO did adopt China as a potential adversary that we needed to build a defense to deter from having a major conflict. And so I think that our Congress is very strongly for NATO because the members of Congress generally have had the briefings and they understand the importance of having 32 in an alliance and 40 outside partners who are in our missions as well. So in Afghanistan, there were 70 of us roughly that were contributing to trying to stabilize the terrorism that was fomenting in Afghanistan. That's where the 9/11 terrorists were training and were recruited. So it was all of our mission to stop that terrorism buildup that would then be leaked into Europe and to the United States. And so I think that Congress, back to a more tangible signal, Congress passed a law that was sort of not really publicized that much, but they passed a law that was signed into law last December that no president could withdraw from NATO without the vote of the Senate. It is a treaty, takes 2/3 vote in the Senate to ratify a treaty. And so the law says that withdrawing from the NATO treaty would be approximately the same requirement. So a president can't go off and say, we're leaving NATO. And that was, I think, the protection that our Congress, with very bipartisan unity, said is the right thing to do. And so we are protected from a flare-up where any president could say, we're leaving. No, we're not. We're committed, and we will keep our commitments.
Great, thank you. So Ambassador Frazer, let me come to you now and return to some of the points that you alluded to earlier in terms of reframing the U.S. approach to Africa. So as you start your essay, the point you start your essay with is that too often in the past, the United States government, Washington, has primarily thought of and discussed Africa as a humanitarian problem, and that we really need to get beyond that, as important as policies like the Bush administration's emergency fund for AIDS in Africa were. There's a lot more to be done. And you alluded to a number of other priorities when you were speaking a minute ago, but I'd like you to do a sort of ranking for us. If you were in charge of Africa policy today, what are the issues where you would push the United States to focus, sort of in order of importance?
Well, I'm going to resist that, but then I'll answer you.
Okay.
And I'll resist it at the start by saying that, people talk about President Bush's PEPFAR program because it was so significant and transformational. But his PEPFAR program was part of a more holistic approach that also had a very strong component on peace and security, a very strong component on economic growth and development and free trade and open markets, and a strong component on human rights and democracy. And each one of those pillars of his policy, which, make the world better, freer, fair, had significant initiatives attached to them. I think they just celebrated the Millennium Challenge account, for example. And so I think that any credible policy, Africa policy, has to be holistic. Now, PEPFAR, and certainly the focus of President Bush's administration on HIV and AIDS in Africa, was because that was the emergency at that time. The emergency of today, and this is where I will answer your question, the emergency of today is economic, right? It's the impact, the exogenous shocks that African countries have gone through, and the need for recovery, both from the COVID, right? COVID impact and shutting down, et cetera, and disruption of trade and access to markets, et cetera, and also the Ukraine war, right? And the impact of our sanctions on Ukraine, which then has led to a lack of wheat flowing, and Russia's attack against Ukraine, and a lack of fuel in Africa, the inflation that's come out of COVID and the Ukraine war has led to huge increase in prices across Africa. And so these economies are tremendously suffering today because of these exogenous shocks. But there's also the structural challenges. The Bretton Woods institutions were created at a time when African countries were colonies, right? They didn't have much say in how the international financial architecture was going to be structured. There's a huge push today to change that, particularly as a result of these exogenous shocks. And they're saying, well, the IMF and the World Bank aren't responding well, but we're the main constituents. And so if I were the president, or if I was, high level in an administration, I would be pushing for us to address the economic issues. And it's not just to help Africa, it's also to help our companies be more competitive, because China has really pushed into Africa significant debt, significant investment. Their companies are all over there. We're being pushed out of the market, a growing market. And so I would be looking for initiatives and incentives and ways in which I could help American companies to be more competitive against state-funded companies and state-owned companies coming out of China.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Tony, I'm going to come to you next. Before I do, I just want to remind our audience that they can start sending in questions, and I'll bring those into the conversation as well. So, Ambassador Garza, in your essay for us, you argue that now is a particularly good moment for the United States to re-engage with Latin America, because you see a strong alignment of interests. Talk about what you think those are. And at the same time, I want you to balance it with a countervailing trend, which is that Latin America, like a lot of regions in the world, seems to be going through a bit of a democratic recession at the moment, where certain countries, whether it's Mexico, which you mentioned, or others like Nicaragua, seem to be moving in a less democratic or more autocratic direction. Now, it's not to suggest that American democracy is perfect either, but how should the United States balance its interest in taking advantage of opportunities with its concerns about things like democracy and human rights?
Yeah, I think that, it's important that we lead with values. And I think when we talk about democracy and human rights, those are fundamental. I tend to see the ability to move in the direction of democracy and human rights broadly under the rubric of rule of law. When societies and countries have a healthy rule of law, that's a long ways, goes a long ways in allowing them to address security issues, issues of economic growth, issues of certainty of contract, and democracy and human rights broadly. So I think we need to lead with our values. Now, one of my, I suppose, pet, peeves, if you will, is that when we say Latin America broadly, I think Mexico has, that case is well documented, the integration, yet there's a democracy deficit in Mexico as well. The ability for them to slip too far, deteriorate too much, I think is limited by virtue of the integration with the United States and the trade agreements that we have. Central America, again, somewhat uneven, but you have, Guatemala's kind of trending a little bit more positively. Costa Rica has always been kind of a beacon there. And same goes for South America. Argentina seems to be kind of experiencing a comeback. So you go country by country. But what I think we need broadly is kind of a values-based approach. I like, for example, the current administration's framing of it. It's not what we can do for countries in Latin America, but what we can do with establish partnerships around specific areas, whether and pathways for American business into many of these regions. I think that's critical for the Partnership for Economic Prosperity that is being led by former Senator Dodd. I think is a good initiative. They tend to fly a bit under the radar because, as I alluded to a second ago, it's not leading the news. Fortunately, we don't have a situation like we do in the Middle East or Ukraine or even the tensions that we have with China. And so there are a lot of, I think significant opportunities around the region, but you have to look at them as discrete and distinct countries, with the natural and most significant platform being the North American one with Mexico. And that's a very large one that I think can bridge to Central America. We have a trade agreement with them. And then country by country, there's some real opportunities for the United States. We just have to be there. We've got to show up. And a big part of our foreign policy is showing up where there's crisis. I think we have to show up where there's opportunity, and that's certainly something I see across Latin America.
Well, thank you for that. So I have many more questions for the three of you, and I could easily hog this whole conversation, but I promised to bring in some from the audience as well. So I'm going to start doing that now. The first is for Senator Hutchison. Paul O'Connor from Cork, Ireland, thank you for joining us, wants to ask you, Senator, whether Britain and France should think about increasing their nuclear arsenals in case the United States withdraws from NATO, which would, such a withdrawal, he said, leave Europe open to nuclear blackmail by Russia. And this sort of gets at the danger, or one of the dangers, of a United States doing less, whether it's NATO or in other organizations or other regions, which is that our partners and allies or countries may feel like they need to do more to take their own protection into their own hands, such as ramping up their nuclear arsenals.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I would never tell any country to do less in their own defense. So I think they have to make their decisions on what their priorities are. And I think that I have tried to show that the chances of America leaving NATO are very, very slim. I think the congressional bipartisanship is the key here, and it is very strong for NATO. Even those who voted against Ukraine in the House many of those were people who do support our foreign policy and do support NATO, but were upset about another issue, and that is our own open border right now. So I think that we have to factor in that there were some votes that were not meaning that they were against NATO or against our partnerships. It's a strong majority in both houses. And I think that will protect us with the new law that has been passed that requires that kind of congressional affirmation for us to make any moves in NATO. But having said all of that, I do think that the move of Europeans to do more in their own defense is a good thing, because that makes them even more valuable partners when they do. On nuclear weapons, I think we have enough right now that would be available as a deterrence, which is what having nuclear arms is what you want it to be. You don't want to be able to use them. You want to be able to deter others from using them who have them. Some of which are our potential adversaries, and some of which are just not responsible. And so I think that having our own arsenal that is up and ready to go if needed is the best deterrence that we can have. So I would leave it up to Britain and France if they want to make these kinds of investments, or if they trust that we have them. We're keeping up ours, and some of those nuclear weapons are in places in Europe that would be readily available.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Beverly Barrett in Houston about China and the best American strategy to counter China's soft power influence, its economic influence in the regions that we're discussing. Jendayi, since you already touched on the strategic competition between the United States and China in Africa, let me ask the same question to you, Tony. First of all, how would you sort of describe the state of play in Latin America today in the competition between China and the United States? And then what are the best things that the United States can do to ensure that it wins this contest and not China?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because if you look at China in Latin America and you look at that period from 2000 to, let's say, 2020, 21, 22, it's a 2-decade period. But still, in terms of a country's moving into a region to the extent that they have, it's really significant. And you look at the trade numbers for Latin America from 2000, when China was doing about $2 billion worth of trade in Latin America, to 2020, when I believe it was $200 billion. To give you some sense of the sea change in terms of their involvement. Also, in the last decade, the Belt and Road Initiative allowed them to, I say, play large, or certainly make significant announcements about their interest in doing business in Latin America around, infrastructure, energy, these sorts of things. But what they've shown to themselves to be are brutal bankers. They are good on the lead, good on the announcement, and I think increasingly Latin American countries are realizing this isn't as good a deal as it sounded like on the day we announced it. And if you move around the region, regardless of the sentiment that is at time expressed about the United States historic, interventionism, or their national sovereignty issues, by and large, Latin Americans would much prefer to be doing business with the United States, U.S. companies, and dealing with U.S. leadership in the region. So it's a function of getting in there. I alluded to Taiwan, and it's not if, but when. And I hope that's never the case, that China moves the way they do. But, and I forget which former secretary, it was likely Baker, that said, our concerns about the Middle East revolve around 3 things: oil, oil, and oil. And I think the new oil are these chips, the advanced chips, and those that are so necessary. And when you think about it, 80–90% of the advanced microchips are coming right out of Taiwan. We've got to build capacity in the United States, in Mexico, in Latin America around these sophisticated chips. I was encouraged to see, for example, Intel announced, I think it was $1.3 billion investment in Costa Rica. I mean, these are sorts of things that security is going to be built around our capacity to compete in technology, artificial intelligence, these sorts of things. And we still have preeminence. We still have leadership in these areas, and to maintain it, I think we're going to have to move away from that dependence somewhat, diversify our dependence away from Taiwan and China. And I think a lot of that can be happening in and around Latin America. Regardless of what you hear about China, yes, they play large. They move on, sort of these kind of an economic giant. Russia plays nimble. Usually it's diplomatic and chicanery. And the U.S. can play as long as we are being smart and being partners, and looking at Latin America and Mexico beyond the prism of, the transnational challenges of immigration and drugs and these sorts of things. We can work with Mexico and Latin America on these things, but we can also partner with them on economic growth. This conversation around root causes. There's days where to me, root cause is really about economic growth. You create opportunities in countries, and you're going to start to address those. You advance rule of law initiatives in countries, and you're going to start to address those. And we've just got to be more active in doing that.
So I have a question from another audience member, Gib Fenegar, which is a good follow-up to that. They point out that it's not only in the United States where isolationism and nationalism are becoming political forces, but they are around the world as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to know what the United States can do without being heavy-handed about it, to encourage other countries to continue to invest in an internationalist, a globalist outlook. Jendayi, I think that you have already alluded to the answer, so I want to tee you up, because your discussion in your essay about taking seriously the concerns that other countries have with the shortcomings in the current international architecture, and helping them address those shortcomings to create an international system that truly reflects everybody's interest or does a better job of it, could be a way forward. But I don't mean to answer in your place, so please.
I appreciate you answering in my place. It's probably a better answer than I would give. But so, yes, I think the way I would put it is, we have partners and allies, and everybody else defaults to partners except for like our NATO allies and, sort of Europe, right? The Atlantic Alliance as such. And we're trying to create further alliances with, Australia and others, right? Focused on Asia. But I think we need to be clearer about what a partner is, right? And create that concept with real content and meaning, right? Because everybody just defaults to partner, and it doesn't really necessarily mean anything other than we're being polite diplomatically. That's how I look at it in Africa. And so I think we have to have some interim categories where the relationship is truly meaningful, and therefore you can build trust on the basis of that, and you can build consistency on the basis of the nature of that relationship. And so that's important, because, for instance, let's take a country like Uganda. Uganda has been very strongly partnered with the United States in the past on AGOA and trade. It was a leader in Africa on HIV and AIDS and how to address that, and the president has to take responsibility for that. On the Iraq war, it was right there with us. On Somalia, it was with us. It sent forces into Somalia. It was strongly in supportive of the United States. And then the issue of gay rights came in, right? A human rights issue in Uganda. And next thing you know, we kicked it out of AGOA. We don't support it. The president, told us, let me handle this. We didn't do that. We came on top. So we exported a cultural war in the United States into Uganda, and we lost a strong partner on so many different, on the economic side, on the security side. So these single issue, we can't allow single issues and single issue constituents to drive what needs to be more strategic relationships. And so that's the one thing, how we treat people and how consistent we are in our engagement with them matters for building that more inclusive global system where we have strong partners going forward. Secondly, President Bush, after the 2008 financial crisis, pushed for the G20 to really stand up and become another form of governance, financial governance, right? Another element of financial governance is the way I would push it. Now the Biden administration is, and in that G20, we had South Africa. And that was a decision that was made by the administration to say, let's be more inclusive. Let's include, South Africa's a big economy. There are 54 countries in Africa, but we'll have at least one of them in there. And now the Biden administration has let the African Union come in. To the degree that people feel that they're part of defining the new rules of the game, that they have a say in what those new rules of the game are, we will have strong allies and partners to work with. And so I think that that's absolutely critical. We can't, it's easy to default to the Atlantic Alliance because we have trust in that, right? We have history there. But we need to actually build that same type of trust and history in other regions, particularly when we have a strategic adversary that has a very different view of how global governance should occur.
Thank you. Now, I have a question from an audience member who happens to be named David Kramer. That happens to be the same name as the executive director of the Bush Institute, who happens to be my boss. Now, I'm sure this is not the same David Kramer because he never listens to these things, but just in case it is, I'm going to pose his question to you. And it's to the three of you. He asks, in Europe, Africa, and Latin America, respectively, which country gives you the greatest hope and which gives you the greatest concern? And let's go back in around the horn in the direction that we were just speaking. So Jendayi, you first, Tony, then you, and then Senator Hutchison. It's
so unfair to me. There's 54 countries.
Look, it's not my question. If you have a problem, take it up with David.
There's 54 countries and they all have warts and they all have positives, right? It's very, very difficult. So boiling it down to one and one, I guess I would say the one that creates the most concern for me is Sudan right now. Sudan and South Sudan. And I'd say that because we put so much, America spent so much political capital, diplomatic heft and engagement and, resources trying to help Sudan and South Sudan get on a stable footing, right? Trying to end a genocide in Darfur, trying to make sure that the Southern people had self-determination, right? And that was driven, again, by America. It was driven by policy, of course, and strategic understanding of Sudan, but also by our communities. There's, like I said, the faith-based communities and organizations very much focused on Sudan. And now we sort of are back at square one. And I say that because there are more people dying in Darfur than in Gaza today. But global attention is on, and I'm not saying it should not be, on the Middle East, on that conflict, but there are more people dying in Darfur today, right? South Sudan has not been able to stand up good governance, right? For all of their push against being oppressed in the north, now that they have their own country, they still haven't put in place the pillars of accountability and transparency that one would expect it given their rhetoric when they were fighting against the North. And so Sudan is the one that I think causes the most concern to me. The greatest promise, I can't say, there's South Africa, which is frankly a democracy with transparency and freedom of the press and rule of law, but a whole bunch of corruption, There's a whole bunch of corruption there. There's Ghana and Senegal and Kenya that have successfully held elections. So I think any country that's dealing with good governance, right? And I think that gets back to Ambassador's point about the rule of law, right? To the degree that you have good governance or better governance, improving governance and the rule of law, and people feel that they can elect their leadership fairly, that gives me hope, because it's in the institutions that, you know, are growing and are being strengthened. And so to the degree that those institutions are tested and they're strengthened, I think that those are the types of countries and societies that I have the greatest hope in Africa.
Thank you. Okay, Ambassador Garza, now you're in the hot seat. Which country gives you the most hope and which gives you the most concern?
Jonathan, I don't think it's going to surprise you. I've lived in Mexico for 22 years, and given the level of integration that Mexico currently enjoys, and the trade infrastructure and a lot of the logistics infrastructure as well, I think with the whole movement around nearshoring, I'm very optimistic, very bullish about Mexico. You know, obviously, I have some concerns about the quality of their democracy. The issues around security and immigration, I think, and drugs need to be addressed in a transnational sort of way. You can't deal with the transnational threat unless you have communication, and that's something that I think continues to be a challenge. You know, the most concern, you know, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, you've got to put them on the list. But in terms of their ability to impact more broadly, kind of the global things that we're talking about, nuclear, you know, capabilities of other in China, I'm a lot more concerned about, you know, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, quite frankly, than obviously any country in Latin America. I think a real opportunity, for example, might be in Guyana. Recently identified 11 billion barrels in reserves. I mean, that's a real opportunity for a country like that. And I think we need to be there, not in the sort of the Latin American perception of us is going in an exploitative way, but going in partnership. Who does energy better than, well, I want to say the United States, but I'm going to say Texas. Who does energy better than Texas? And I think there's a lot of opportunities for lending technology expertise in those to our private sector. And that's something that, again, we talk about governments a lot, but our private sector can lead in so many areas, lead through investment, lead through values, whether it's, you know, sustainable development, renewable energy, entrepreneurship, innovation, technology. And these are, and this is not something done out of, you know, any sort of philanthropic. These are good markets with real opportunities, both in terms of consumers and manufacturing. So, you know, the beauty of Latin America is, yeah, there's some challenges, but when you look around the world, they're relatively generally to the plus side by comparison.
Great, thank you. Okay, Senator Hutchison, David's question to you. As you look at Europe, which country gives you the most hope and which the most concern?
Well, in Europe, I'm going to take it a little different direction. I'm going to say that the hope is the evolution of Eastern Europe and its contribution to the EU and the economics. The Eastern Europeans they're hungry for freedom. They're learning about the rule of law. They are very looking to America for leadership and taking the advice that we're giving. So I'd say the ray of hope is Eastern Europe. I would say the caution and concern area would be those countries that are backsliding a bit, Hungary, Turkey, Slovakia, trying to get back into the Russian orbit. So that would be the concern in Europe. I also, though, want to just go off message here, because we don't have a Middle Eastern representative of our ambassadors, and just say that while, you can see everything that is the concern in the Middle East right now. But here's my ray of hope. I was just in Saudi Arabia about a month ago. And if you look at the ray of hope for the Middle East, starting with the Abraham Accords, which was just cataclysmic in trying to bring an Israeli trade opportunity, opening relationships with some of the Middle Eastern countries, and now followed on by this administration's efforts to bring Saudi Arabia in to what could be the real hope for the settling of the Middle East in a much more long-term way. And that is with Saudi Arabia and America making a security agreement that is solid. And that's what Saudi Arabia wants. What we want is to have a relationship with led by Saudi Arabia for two-state solution, for there to be the Saudi-Israeli normalization, and brokering with Saudi Arabia and the other Arab nations for a two-state solution, which the Arabs would take a strong role in assuring good governance for the Palestinian people. And so I know I'm off on this, but the ray of hope for the future is in the works right now, with a combination, I have to say, of a Trump beginning and a Biden maybe finishing, hopefully, something that would put the whole Palestinian Gaza issue to bed, wipe out Hamas leadership of that poor country that has had to live with those terrorists, and that the Saudis would take ownership of it, along with the other Middle Eastern countries that do want peace in the region.
Well, that was such a great answer and so hopeful and so bipartisan that I think it's a perfect place for us to stop, because it also happens to be the case that we're out of time, so we have to do it anyways. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I want to thank our three ambassadors and expert authors for joining us. It's been truly first class. If you in the audience enjoyed this as much as I did and want to read more, you can find their articles and the rest of the new issue of The Catalyst at bushcenter.org/catalyst. Please join us again soon for more good stuff. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. Thanks again for Zooming in. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for your leadership. Bye-bye.
Thank you.